Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today I'm going to dive into a new little series that somebody suggested, which is doing a review of offshore jurisdictions for you to explain a little bit about them. We'll see how, deep I dive into, there's some really far out ones like Nauru that most people have never heard of and really are not so relevant. And there's some others that are much more common, like the one I'm going to cover today. But we're going to see which ones I decide to go into, just depending on what you guys like. So if you're interested in these reviews about offshore jurisdictions and going through them one by one, please let me know. You can put it in the comments below, and I'll do more of them. If not, hey, listen, let me know about that as well, and I'll do the rest of them. So today we're going to discuss what is the most popular traditional offshore jurisdiction for company formation anyway, which is British Virgin Islands. And I will say from the beginning that even when BVI was super popular and super common, I almost never used BVI in our structures, okay? And I'll go through in a little bit coming up here, why it is that I didn't do that and why, honestly, I rarely recommend it today. But today I'm going to cover what to know about BVI, what not to know about BVI, things that maybe make it attractive, the things that don't make it attractive. And I think most importantly, what circumstances make it a jurisdiction that might be worth looking at, and what cases, it's not worth looking at. So we're going to do that. And before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, hit all notifications. If you like our videos, check out some others. We have lots of them. And please let us know what you'd like to see in the future. If you'd like help with international structuring, international tax optimization, setting up residencies and citizenships, forming companies and opening bank accounts, all this international business, international relocation stuff, please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. Or send us a message to our websites, offshorecitizen.net or offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so BVI, or British Virgin Islands, as it is well known, like I said, is the most popular traditional tax haven. Maybe back in the day, I think they had 625,000 businesses registered there or something in this little tiny island or set of islands. Actually, there's quite a few of them in the Caribbean. And they, I think, partially are popular because they introduced some of the original international business companies legislation. They actually changed that. There's no such thing as a BVI IBC. The term IBC is used colloquially now to refer to all kinds of things. So sometimes I'll hear people mention about like a Panama IBC, and there is no Panama IBC. It doesn't exist. It's just kind of a term that people use to kind of denote a company that is usually doing international business and not really present locally and zero tax. So BVI introduced their Business Companies Act, and there's some history you can go through on that. But anyway, that was the story. Now, for a long time, even when it was popular, I didn't use it or would rarely use it. The reason was basically cost. At the time, you could typically, and I mean, at the time is sort of relative. If you were to go back to the 80s or something, that's a little bit different. But by the mid-2000s anyway, you had countries like Anguilla who had basically copied British Virgin Islands laws and improved on them a bit and were much cheaper. So it didn't really make a lot of sense to me to use BVI. It made more sense to use someplace like Anguilla. And there was a few different options that a person could go through, mainly based on cost, based on some things to do with privacy, ease of setup, etc. Today, things have changed quite a bit because almost all the Caribbean countries are useful, or useless rather, in many situations. So what changed was, starting in 2015, you had FATCA came in. That's the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act that started information sharing. Then you had CRS. And around then, you got a lot of crackdown on banking. Banking became much more difficult, and it just became hard to open accounts for a lot of these companies. So increasingly, ever since then, we've seen it get tougher and tougher to open accounts for companies like BVI companies. And they've done some things to kind of fight back against that. For example, when the EU brought in the EU Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive and the OECD brought in the Base Erosion Profit Shifting Initiative, or action plan, which were designed to try and combat some of this, BVI brought in substance requirements, which again, I'll talk about in just a second here. But that being said, the general reputation is these are seen as high-risk countries, and I think you can kind of understand why. The basic mindset is if somebody has a company in BVI, why is it there? Right? Why aren't you using a company in your local country? And usually it's, for some sort of confidentiality, in which case they wonder, well, why do you want to keep privacy, right? What is it you're hiding? Or you want to reduce tax. So British Virgin Islands is one of the countries in the world that has just zero tax across the board. It's not like you have to find special exceptions. There's some Caribbean countries or countries in that region where they have IBC legislation where the way that it works is the country itself has tax, but you can get these special IBC companies that are zero tax. And that's to kind of encourage some formation of entities there. BVI is not like that. BVI is just plain flat zero tax. So very, very clean, very, very clear. The reality is there's little infrastructure there. There's little in the way of talent pool. You have hurricanes that come through. The culture is not really a good working culture. You really don't have banking options, et cetera. This is all locally, right? So really the only thing you can set up in BVI that's practical is a company. Okay, you're not going to have bank accounts there. You're not going to have payment processing there. You're not going to have a team there. You're not going to have all this stuff. Maybe you could have a tourist resort, right? If you were going to form, some sort of a, hotel there, something. Okay, great. Maybe something to do with shipping, et cetera. You could maybe argue through there, but not a lot in that area. And as a result, that makes it, not really great if you're wanting to really form a real company there. And that's sort of the move to what we sometimes refer to as mid-shore, right? You have offshore and then you have onshore, and then you've got these countries that appeal to, they're optimized, but they're still more credible. Some people will say BVI is more credible than most of these other places. I'm pretty skeptical. The reality is they show up on the same lists as most of the others, whether it's Nevis or Antigua or some of these others. This being said, familiarity has played a traditional role. For example, at Hong Kong and Singapore banks, it was easier to open accounts for BVI companies than it was for, actually, ironically, even something like a Gibraltar company at some point in time, even though Gibraltar is arguably a cleaner jurisdiction. Anyway, so let's go through. So fairly fast to form a company in BVI. Takes around a week once you've got all the paperwork together. They have increased their standards in terms of the documentation and the information that they want you to provide. So it's no longer nearly so opaque in terms of ownership details, et cetera. They kind of have had some things pushed on them by UK as a British overseas territory that has resulted in it, being more open in that regard. As I said, there are substance requirements, and the substance requirements don't apply to everything. So basically what they'll say is it doesn't apply to limited partnerships. It doesn't apply to BVI companies that are tax resident elsewhere, which, usually you wouldn't want it to be tax resident elsewhere if you wanted to optimize tax. So it's questionable why you'd have a BVI company and then have a tax resident elsewhere. That's a whole other conversation. So it doesn't apply in those cases, and it only applies for a list of 8 industries, which includes, or 8 types of companies. So IP companies, shipping companies, banking companies, insurance companies, holding companies, a couple others. Anyway, there's a good chance that in your situation, maybe that wouldn't apply to you, right? I mean, depending on what you're doing, possibly you don't have that requirement. If you do have that requirement, there's 2 pieces. One is the management control has to take place in BVI. And again, this just makes a problem because who are you going to get to be the management and controlling party? There's not a lot of options for you, and it's not like you're going to locate your core team there. So the likelihood that you're going to have skilled management or directorship in BVI is pretty low, right? Second is that you need to pass what they call an adequacy test. The adequacy test essentially means that you have sufficient personnel and expenditures in order to justify the nature of the business. So as a result, this has really pushed a lot of businesses out of BVI. It's just not that compelling. However, some advantages, if you can utilize it, is you have no financial statement filings required each year, so it makes it easy to maintain. It's relatively inexpensive. You're talking about probably, depending on the service provider and things like this, around a couple grand to form a BVI company. So pretty cheap to maintain. A little bit annoying, I find, in terms of winding it down. Some countries, you just stop paying for a company and it goes to oblivion. In BVI, they actually have a process where they want you to pay a bunch of money in order to close it down. And you're going to find, actually, this is a useful thing to know. So sometimes when you want to shut down a company, you end up in a situation where you shut it down. Here, they want you to do a liquidation. Okay, and this liquidation procedure, if you go to these providers, they'll rip you off, basically. They're going to say, oh, you know, we need you to go and look at all these, we need to fully examine the nature of the company and the books and all that. We're going to charge you 15 grand to close down this company. Even though the company may have never done anything, you know, the argument is, well, they don't know that and they have to go through this proper liquidation period process. There is another way to close the company down that doesn't require that. And the consequence is basically that, you know, somebody can still come after you for 5 years. So what I want to tell you as a piece of advice is if you're closing down a BVI company, don't go through this liquidation procedure. It's a waste of money. It's a scam. Instead, just go through the simplified procedure. It's probably going to cost around $750 to close it down. The consequence is, you know, hey, listen, you don't have some sort of magic liability protection, but the reality is you're probably not, you are probably aware of what those risks are anyway, and realistically, you probably weren't getting that much protection from it anyway. So like I said, it's kind of a scam. So that's something to be aware of. Where do I think BVI companies are useful? So as I said, the biggest problem to me in BVI companies, aside from the fact that, okay, now the substance requirements are a bit of a pain in the ass, they have these, you know, little annoying things with their filings, etc. The biggest complaints that I have is simply banking. Okay, you just cannot bank very easily in most parts of the world, or if you do, you pay higher fees. Or rather, what I should probably clarify is you can open bank accounts in a few places, but they're with bad banks. So I've done a video previously on what are the banks that I wouldn't recommend or what areas I would recommend not to bank. That's pretty much where you can bank with BVI companies. There's a few exceptions that are okay, but usually the fees that they charge you then are pretty exorbitant. So as a result, you just kind of have to ask yourself, you're like, okay, well, if I have another alternative, and you almost always do, why would you choose BVI? And the answer is rarely would you want to. Now, where I would choose, and kind of the most common place that I have seen or used BVI today, which I do sometimes get people coming to me and they're talking about this, and so I would say BVI is an outdated jurisdiction. So generally speaking, if somebody's recommending BVI to you, probably not the right fit, with at least one possible exception. And that main exception is if you're doing some sort of a crypto business that doesn't require banking. So if you're doing, for example, an ICO, there may be an argument for using a BVI company. So basically, if you don't have to have banking, then sure, consider BVI might be an okay option for you. If you need banking, probably it's not a good option. And even if you don't need banking, maybe it's still not, there might be some other better jurisdiction. Hard to say. That's like a case by case. So anyway, bottom line is today, the cases that I recommend BVI companies is maybe like 1%. It's very low, but once in a while it can be useful. It is true that it has somewhat of a better reputation than some of these other places, but the truth is not in a meaningful way for the most part. In other words, most of the time, the places that would open a bank account for your BVI company would also open it for a Nevis or an Anguilla or something else company. All right, so you don't really get much benefit in that regard. Over time, they may be doing something where the changes they're making could have some impact. You can see places like Isle of Man, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Jersey, Guernsey, these jurisdictions that have tried to be whiter than white and build a local fiduciary service, etc., that you actually can use, which you typically wouldn't be able to in BVI. BVI may try and head that direction. The problem is, they're competing with those jurisdictions which are well established, which have professional service providers, which have banking locally, which have all these different things. So anyway, I hope that helps, gives you some idea. If you have questions about it, please put it in the comments below. But that's just a brief little overview. And I'm going to look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.